Thank you so much for being here tonight. And not only you people here at St. Louis Parish in Clarksville, those of you who are out there watching us on Facebook Live. And anybody who's watching on Facebook Live, tell your friends, text your friends, that they can watch too by going to facebook.com/sunlight. We're pleased tonight to have Wesley Smith, one of the most prominent proponents of defeating things like physician-assisted suicide. Just recently, we were blessed when he moved from Southern California, where he spent basically all of his life, to this area. So now he's much more available to help us defeat physician-assisted suicide. Already 6 states in America, including California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Colorado, and Vermont, have laws legalizing physician-assisted suicide. We need to defeat this, and we have the best speaker in the world to tell us exactly how to do it. Wesley is the author and co-author of 14 different books. He's a phenomenal speaker. It's with great pleasure that we introduce Wesley Smith.
Thank you. Is everybody happy? Yes. You know, I was thinking, I was in Kansas speaking last week, Kansas Right to Life banquet, and I was in the restroom, the men's room, just before the speech, and I was washing my face, and the fellow at the sink next to me said, "Oh yes, we have to wash our faces so we can stay awake for the speaker." And I said, "The speaker has to do that too." And he was, "Oh no!" It's all right. It's all right. I really appreciate, Jack, you having me here to do this. It's very important because Maryland is ground zero for assisted suicide advocacy. They have been after this state for a long time. It would break this part of the world. So I'm really happy to be able to try to contribute to fighting that. Whether it's this year or next year, they're coming back, and they're coming back, and they're coming back. And Smith's view on public policy and who wins and who loses, he or she with the most energy wins. And they've got a lot of energy and they've got a lot of money. It's provided mostly by George Soros. But people who understand the importance of protecting the vulnerable and the weak and the sick and the aged and the disabled and the mentally ill have to have more energy and have to fight this. Now, one of the things I've been trying to do lately when I speak to audiences such as this is to try to help people, and people on Facebook, hello, try to help people understand that a lot of your fellow citizens do not agree with your worldview, which I'm sure you've kind of sort of figured out. But you may not understand what it is that has shifted so that people would accept such a thing as medicine being an intentional overdose of poison pills. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath prescribes assisted suicide quite specifically. That's 2,500 years old. And it says quite specifically that a doctor shall not assist in a suicide. Of course, doctors don't take the Hippocratic Oath anymore. And a lot of people don't know that. They don't take it anymore because the Hippocratic Oath gets in the way of some modern ideas about what a doctor's job should be, including the assisted suicide prescription, the abortion prescription, and some others. But I got into this issue 25 years ago, actually. My first anti-euthanasia piece was published in June of 1993. I can't believe it's been that long. And as time went on and I got involved in this issue, maybe at some point I'll explain how that happened and why, I used to ask myself the why now question. Have you ever asked yourselves the why now question? Yeah, a lot of people ask themselves the why now question. I mean, 100 years ago, if you died of bone cancer, you probably died in agony, right? 100 years ago, if you ended up with a burst appendix, just as an example, you probably died in agony. And yet 100 years ago, you didn't see all of this idea of death with dignity, medical aid in dying, euthanasia, assisted suicide, none of that. Yet today, when pain can be substantially alleviated, When medicine has just come forth with miracle treatments for people who are going through extreme conditions, now we're talking death with dignity, assisted suicide. Why now? Why now? And I never could figure it out, the why now question, until I read a book by a local fellow in D.C. named Yuval Levin. Some of you may have heard of him. He wrote a book called Imagining the Future. Now, Yuval Levin is a conservative bioethicist type. He's a protege of the great Leon Kass, who was the head of the President's Council on Bioethics under President Bush. And Yuval Levin wrote this book, Imagining the Future. It's about the stem cell issue, which we will not discuss tonight. But he had a little bit in some of his introductory remarks in the book. He answered for me the why now question. And I would like to share with you what Yuval Levin wrote and explain what it means, not only in terms of our society, but in terms of this particular debate. And he wrote this. He's talking about Descartes. Descartes was awfully bold in describing health as without a doubt the primary good and the foundation of all other goods of this life. Surely the claim that health is the primary good has consequences well beyond the agenda of the scientists. Any society's understanding of the foundational good necessarily gives shape to its politics, its social institutions, and its sense of moral purpose and direction. How you live has a lot to do with what you strive for. And health is an unusual candidate for the primary good. It is surely an essential good. Without health, not much else can be enjoyed. But Descartes' formulation in the worldview of modern science sees health not only as a foundation, but also a principal goal. Not only as a beginning, but also an end. And this is the key, this next sentence. Relief and preservation from disease and pain, from misery and necessity, become the defining ends of human actions, and therefore of human society. What Yuval Levin is saying is that eliminating suffering has become, for many people in this society, the primary purpose of our existence, eliminating suffering. I think all of you in this audience would say, no, protecting innocent human life is the fundamental purpose of society, protecting our citizens. These are not compatible worldviews. So if eliminating suffering becomes the primary purpose, that very quickly morphs over into eliminating the sufferer. And therefore you begin to justify things like lethal injection, euthanasia, or assisted suicide where a doctor prescribes poison pills for someone to take. But it doesn't just stop there. The very concept of the kind of suffering that it takes to be willing to eliminate the sufferer becomes elastic. Let me give you an example out of my own life. My mother, God rest her soul, died in August of 2016 of Alzheimer's disease at age 99, with all her own teeth, she wanted me to tell you. She did. At age 99 in my home, where my wife and I took my mother in for the last 6 months of her life, and we had hospice care and so forth and so on. My mother suffered, there's no question. I suffer. I mean, it's very difficult, I'm sure many of you know, to help your parent who's going through that kind of difficulty. Now, some would say that my suffering and my wife's suffering, who also suffered watching me suffer, right, would justify an assisted suicide. And one of the people who actually said that was Brittany Maynard. Brittany Maynard, you may recall, was the woman with a tragic young woman with brain cancer. And she moved, when she got the terminal diagnosis, she moved from California to Oregon so she could have an assisted suicide. Then she contacted Compassion and Choices, which used to be more honestly named the Hemlock Society. Compassion and Choices tries to sell itself as a patient's rights group. What they really are is about pushing assisted suicide, and they throw a lot of stuff in on the side to try to make themselves legitimate. But they are the primary pushers of assisted suicide in this country. And Brittany Maynard then was the subject of a multi-million-dollar PR campaign because she wanted to commit assisted suicide, so that she became covered completely in all the media, by CNN, by ABC, by all of the newspapers. She became an A-list style celebrity for a period of time. Why? Because she wanted to commit assisted suicide. And there were two reasons that she gave for wanting to do that. The first was she was worried about suffering, which anyone can understand. You contract brain cancer, it's going to be a real concern. Yet, she didn't try hospice. She refused specifically to try hospice. She said she didn't try hospice because she gave a worst-case scenario that could happen to her. When Dr. Ira Byock is just one example, who was one of the great hospice physicians in this country, went on ABC News, Good Morning America, I believe it was, to tell the country, wait a second, there are things that can be done for people, even with brain cancer, to alleviate their suffering and to make sure that they have comfort and so forth. She got mad at Ira Byock. How dare you say this? The Right to Die folks said, how dare you talk about this? You're not treating her. Well, of course, he wasn't saying what I would do with Brittany, but he was saying as a general idea what can be done for people with brain cancer, just as she was saying as a general idea, oh my gosh, I'm going to suffer unbearably, which I don't believe would have been true, but she never tried the hospice option. The second reason she gave for wanting assisted suicide was she said, I don't want my family to see me go through this because they love me and it will hurt them. In other words, at least part of the reason that Brittany Maynard committed assisted suicide was to put herself out of her family's misery. And you do see a lot of talk here in terms of the example I gave with my mother, of people saying, I don't want to be a burden, I should have assisted suicide. How have we created a society where people who are elderly, people who are ill, people who are disabled, people who have needs for care, have come to think that they're a burden? That's on us. What have we done? Well, one of the things we've done is to accept the premise that suffering is an acceptable, killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering. Because when you say, okay, let's say my mother had said, gee, this is really tough, and it was. What if she'd said in one of her cogent moments, which she had, you know what, why don't I get assisted suicide? And if I had said to my mother, oh, okay, Mom, it's your choice, that would have made her want to kill herself. Because that would have confirmed her every fear that she was a burden, that her life wasn't as valuable anymore because she was ill, that I would be better off without her around, that I didn't love her as much if she became ill and sick and so forth. It would not have necessarily been an intentional cruelty, but I submit it would have been a cruelty. Because why are people committing assisted suicide? All the statistics in Oregon show it, in Washington State, in the states in this country, also in the Netherlands and Belgium and Canada, which I'll get into in more detail. It isn't because of pain. Pain is the selling, fear-mongering. Oh, this is only going to be this teeny-weeny, little tiny, itty-bitty change for people who are in terrible pain, for whom nothing else can be done to alleviate suffering. A, false premise. B, it doesn't require it in any of the legislation or laws that are in effect. And C, they don't mean it. They don't mean it. In fact, the reason why people commit assisted suicide, fear of being a burden, fear of losing dignity. What does that mean? That means I will not have the kind of status that will make me as lovable as I am now. Or people will think less of me because I might not look as pretty as I once did, or there might be some odors associated with my condition. It's existential fear. It's existential worry with which we can all empathize and should empathize very deeply if we're human beings, but which can be handled just like most pain can be handled. There are techniques, there are methods to help people get through that darkness. Yet when we say, okay, here are your pills, we're basically saying you're not worth the time to do that. We're saying, well, if you don't value your life, I don't either. It masked as choice, right? But you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's not choice because it's in a condition of extremis. And if there's coercion, we'll never know because coercion happens behind closed doors. So, we have that aspect of the assisted suicide issue. Not only suffering eliminating suffering by eliminating the sufferer, but the suffering of family and loved ones that might go into the consideration for deciding that assisted suicide is the approach to take. Then you also have the other angle of it, which could be the cost of care, right? The suffering of the society. We hear a lot about healthcare resources and so forth. So assisted suicide is a splendid way to help with the cost problems we have in terms of medicine. Canada has bragged about the millions and millions of dollars it is saving on euthanasia because it doesn't cost much. Let me put it this way. It might cost $1,000 or $2,000 to go through an assisted suicide when you include the doctor's visits and the drugs, which are not expensive. It could cost $100,000 of intense care and love to make it so that somebody doesn't want assisted suicide. Once you become normalized, once it becomes acceptable, the force of gravity seems to be pretty obvious. And in fact, Derek Humphrey, who founded the Hemlock Society when it was more honestly named, wrote a book in which he called cost containment the unstated argument in favor of assisted suicide. Because so much could be saved for people who want to be healed and want to be treated by helping to kill those who don't. So this concept of suffering as the primary, eliminating suffering as the primary purpose of society has a lot of consequences. And it leads to a dramatically different place than if you believe, as we do in this room, at least most of us I believe, that the protection of innocent human life is the primary purpose of our society. You might start, if you're taking different paths at 1 degree of separation, for a long time you're walking pretty close to each other, but eventually you end up on the other side of the world. And that's what it is with this kind of circumstance here. And to show you how things have changed, I just want to go back in time a little bit. How many of you remember Michael Landon? Michael Landon, most of you, wow. Michael Landon, the actor. He was, when I was a young boy, he was Little Joe on Bonanza, right? Yeah, Bonanza, yeah. I was about to go into the theme song, but I had a senior synapse and now I don't remember. Yeah, Sunday night, that's right. And then after that, he was Pa on Little House on the Prairie. And then after that, he was an angel, I think, on Highway to Heaven. Yep. And you may all remember that in his prime, he was probably in his late 40s, perhaps his early 50s, really at the top of his career, very, very A-list kind of television star. He contracted pancreatic cancer. And in those days, cancer, people were shoved off in these dark corners. We didn't want to hear about it. We didn't want to think about it. But Michael Landon did something quite extraordinary for the time, which was in the early 90s. He went on Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show, to discuss with Johnny Carson that he was terminally ill. That made a huge sensation because Michael Landon was there helping others in the TV audience face this very difficult thing of having cancer. And it was a wonderful service he performed. And when the end finally came, People magazine did a tribute. And they called it Goodbye, Little Joe. And they described Michael Landon's courage because he faced his illness with fortitude and with a smile on his face and helping other people. And here's what they wrote. This is People magazine. As word of his condition spread, thousands of letters of encouragement and sympathy arrived daily. Scores of friends visited the house and stood vigil at the gates of the ranch. I have X amount of energy, said Landon, and what I have I want to spend with my family. Landon's youngest son, Sean, 4, and Jennifer, 7, were emotionally distraught, says longtime friend and business partner Kent McRae, but Michael passed his strength along to them. According to colleague John Warren, Landon also spent time videotaping his last wishes to family and friends. If his friends and family had solace, it was in Landon's extraordinary calm. Says Flynn in his old friend's last hours, it was like going off a diving board. He knew it was coming, and he was brave to the last. People magazine. Fast forward to 2014, and People magazine, the same magazine, describes Brittany Maynard and her decision to commit assisted suicide. For the past 29 years, Brittany Maynard has lived a fearless life, running half marathons, traveling through Southeast Asia for a year, and even climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. So it's no surprise she is facing her death the same way. On Monday, Maynard will launch an online video campaign with the nonprofit Compassionate Choices, an end-of-life choice advocacy organization. No, I won't say it. To fight for expanding death with dignity laws nationwide. Look what courage, the concept and the definition of courage, has shifted. From Michael Landon to pushing assisted suicide as an act of courage. And when she did kill herself, CNN named her one of the extraordinary women of 2014 because she committed suicide. Think about that. That's nihilism. Because she committed suicide. At that time, there was another woman named Lauryn Hill. How many of you have heard of Lauryn Hill? Very few. That's telling. Not your fault. Lauryn Hill was even younger than Brittany Maynard. Lauryn Hill got the same brain cancer as Brittany Maynard. But Lauryn Hill didn't fight for death with dignity. She fought for life with dignity. Lauryn Hill determined, she was a college basketball player, to continue playing basketball. And then she spent her time raising money for cancer research. And when she died naturally, she got a very little tiny itsy-bitsy press in the sports press, and people actually gave her 186 words in her obituary. Fighting for life with dignity. Brittany Maynard got 1,000 words from People magazine, which for that magazine is a lot, because she pushed assisted suicide. This is because there are a lot of us in this country and around the world in the West that believe that eliminating suffering is the primary goal, the primary directive. And if that means eliminating sufferer, to do that, well, so be it, because we cannot have suffering. I sometimes, in the Netherlands, they kill babies born with birth defects. They kill babies born with disabilities. They kill babies born with terminal conditions. And I cry out against it as often as I can. And I get hate mail from the Netherlands. You think, what, the Dutch? Yeah. And inevitably, the hate mail I receive from the Netherlands, because I've decried infanticide, says, I abhor suffering. And the doctors kill these babies because they believe they're doing them a favor. Because they call it an unlivable life, which is just bigotry against people with disabilities. Just bigotry. Well, let's see what happens when one accepts this concept of killing as an acceptable end to the human suffering. When one accepts the belief that eliminating suffering justifies eliminating the sufferer. The first country to widely really push this agenda was the Netherlands. In 1972, a doctor euthanized her mother in a nursing home. And the doctor went to the police and said, I just killed my mother. And there was a trial. Now, understand that the trial was not intended to put the doctor in jail. The expert witnesses for the prosecution said we should have euthanasia in the Netherlands. The idea here was to create a precedent so that doctors could perform euthanasia, not legally, but without punishment, because they would know the proper guidelines. And that's when the guidelines come forward. Things like repeated requests. Nothing else can be done to alleviate suffering except killing, which again is a false premise. a second opinion by a doctor to make sure that the patient was suffering, and so forth. And of course, the doctor was convicted, but not punished in any way. And the Netherlands, the Dutch, came up with a euthanasia quasi-legalization or decriminalization, that if a doctor believed that euthanasia should be done, if they killed the patient, if they went to the coroner and they followed the guidelines, they wouldn't be prosecuted. And then in 2002, they formally legalized it so you didn't have to go through the coroner. It's now legal. What has happened in the Netherlands since they started this? Dutch doctors have gone from killing the terminally ill who ask for it, to killing the chronically ill who ask for it, to killing people with disabilities who ask for it, to killing the elderly who are tired of life who ask for it, or something like macular degeneration. There was a case where a woman had macular degeneration and that was deemed proper suffering for euthanasia, to killing the mentally ill who ask for it, who are not sick. And the Dutch Supreme Court actually had a case on that, and the case involved a woman named Hilly. Hilly wanted to kill herself. She didn't have cancer, she didn't have diabetes, she didn't have multiple sclerosis or any disease. Her 2 children had died. She was in deep grief. One child had died of suicide and one child had died of cancer. Her husband had abused her and left her. So now Hilly had one goal left in life, and that was to be buried between her 2 dead children. She bought a cemetery plot. She put one child on one side, one child on the other, and the only thing that was remaining was for her to get in that ground. She met a psychiatrist named Chabot, C-H-A-B-O-T. Chabot was trolling, and I use the term intentionally as a pejorative, for patients of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. Now, you would think that in the Netherlands, which had such a wide-open euthanasia permissiveness, you wouldn't need a voluntary euthanasia society. But here's something to remember when the next time in America, when they say, this is only going to be for the terminally ill, realize that it's never going to stay there once people accept the premise. We're having a fight in this country where it has not gone as far as the Netherlands because so many people in this country still do not accept the premise. And so they're still playing the pretense game of it's only for the terminally ill. Well, there are a lot of people who suffer far more than the terminally ill and for a far longer period. So there's no logical reason if killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering or assisting suicide is an acceptable answer to human suffering. The issue is suffering, not terminal illness. So there's no reason to leave it to the terminally ill, but the terminally ill in this country is kept as a kind of a point of argument because they know that many more people will accept that than if you go right into where it ultimately leads, which is people with mental illnesses and so forth. In any event, Hilly met Chabot. She told him why she wanted to die. He saw her 4 times over 5 weeks. He never once tried to treat her depression. He then assisted her suicide. It was brought to the Dutch Supreme Court, again, not to put Dr. Chabot in jail, but to set a precedent. And the Dutch Supreme Court ruled, well, I'll summarize. They said, that's right, suffering is suffering. It doesn't matter whether it's physical or mental. The only thing they said that Chabot did wrong was when he had the second opinion, he didn't have her meet the second opinion psychiatrist. The second opinion just looked at her records. So of course nothing was done. It's very interesting. I wrote a book on assisted suicide called Forced Exit, Euthanasia, Assisted Suicide, and the New Duty to Die. And in researching that book, I went to the Netherlands and I spoke with people who were both pro-euthanasia and anti-euthanasia. And one of the people I met was Eugene Sartorius. Eugene Sartorius was Dr. Chabot's lawyer. And he was very gracious. He welcomed me into his office. He knew who I was. He knew my agenda. But he was very kind with a big smile. And I have to say, I really liked him. I mean, he was very gracious. I saw another, I'm a lawyer, don't hold it against me. I saw another legal mind that was sharp and so forth. Don't get me wrong, he's Darth Vader, but I liked him. And we're having our talk, and at one point he leans in front of his office and he leans forward and he smiles big and he says, "Did you know I've become Catholic?" I said, "Does the Pope know?" But he told me very clearly, he said there was never any intention of putting Dr. Chabot in jail or taking away his license to practice psychiatry or to practice medicine. That the whole thing was so that the Supreme Court would say, yes, it's okay to do it to the mentally ill, and here are the guidelines. In the Netherlands, as I mentioned, they kill babies. Kill babies in their cribs if they're born with certain disabilities. There's even a protocol for it. Now, it's not legal to kill babies, but nothing's ever done about it because the guidelines are meaningless. Once the guidelines are in place, they're meant to be ignored, or they're come to be seen as obstacles to the eliminating suffering agenda that we've discussed. And so there's something, if you want to look it up at some point when you get home, called the Groningen Protocol, Groningen. And that is a bureaucratic checklist to tell doctors, pediatricians, etc., which babies they can kill. Now, you'd think there'd be an uproar against the idea of infanticide. I mean, doctors have been hanged for that after World War II, killing disabled babies. You would be wrong. The Groningen Protocol was published, to show you the currents, with all due respect and without criticism in the New England Journal of Medicine, the most prestigious medical journal in the world. We got trouble. We got trouble right here in River City, right? Because the medical intelligentsia has fallen for this notion of suffering and also has fallen for an idea of something called patient rights, which isn't the right of the patient to be treated properly, but the right of the patient to receive whatever legal treatment the patient may want, even if the doctor has conscientious or moral objections or religious objections, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Just more on the Dutch, they don't necessarily, supposedly it's supposed to be about choice, right? Choice. The Dutch doctors kill hundreds of people a year who've never asked to be killed. It's called termination without request or consent. And a study was published in 2015 that found that 431 Dutch people were killed by their doctors to eliminate suffering, but they had not met the guidelines of repeated requests and so forth. I mean, there are stories I've heard. One of the worst stories is of a nun. And the nun was dying of cancer, and she was in significant pain, and so she called her doctor, and could somebody get me a glass of water, please? Thank you. Oh, perfect. Thank you. I'm sorry it's a little warm, and I could use a drink. Now, if I was in politics, I'd be in trouble for that. But I'm not. So, where was I?
The nun.
The nun, thank you. Another senior synapse. The nun had cancer, and she was afraid to go in the hospital because she was afraid she'd be euthanized. And her doctor said, no, come into the hospital. I'm not going to euthanize you. I'm going to treat your pain. Come in. So the nun came in, started receiving pain control. The doctor went home for the weekend. He came back to see his patient Monday, and there was a different patient in the bed. And he said, where's my patient? And they said, oh, we needed the bed for another case. We euthanized her.
Oh my God.
This is in Herbert Hendon's book about assisted suicide in the Netherlands. So, I mean, that's anecdotal, but that's the kind of thing that can happen once you accept the concept. It isn't just, oh, by the way, the Netherlands has conjoined euthanasia with organ harvesting. So you kill the patient, then you take their organs. So that's how, my first piece I told you I wrote in 1993, I warned that that would happen. I said, eventually it's called The Whispers of Strangers. You can look that up too on the internet. Wesley J. Smith, Whispers of Strangers, it'll pop up. And I warned that eventually assisted suicide and euthanasia would be conjoined with organ harvesting as a plumb to society to give us all a stake in it, right? And I was called an alarmist, and I it's called the slippery slope argument, where, it's not going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Well, it is happening. And it's happening even more so in Belgium, which I'll get to. Now, in Switzerland, they have suicide clinics where people fly from around the world to be made dead. They pay about $8,000 to $10,000 to be made dead. So they'll fly into Geneva, let's say, in the business class, and they'll fly home in the hold. There have been really awful cases. For example, this is just one. Because you've accepted the concept of eliminating suffering by eliminating the sufferer, a woman, an Italian woman, went to the suicide clinic over her depression because she didn't feel she was pretty anymore because she was elderly. Her suicide was assisted, and the first her family knew about it was when they received her ashes in the grave. How's that for compassion? By the way, in Switzerland, the Constitution protects the individual dignity of plants. I'm not talking ecosystems, I'm talking individual plants. It is illegal to flush a live goldfish down the toilet. Yet, they permit assisted suicide clinics to thrive. Thousands die there. I put a piece on National Review The Corner today. This kind of stunned me that there's a suicide club or a suicide organization called Exit, which is one of the suicide clinics. There are more in Germany, more than 100,000 members of this suicide organization called Exit. Now, they're not all going to kill themselves, but 100,000 people think, if I ever end up in a circumstance of difficulty, I'll kill myself and they'll help me. And that's why they join. I find it terribly tragic. And it's normalizing suicide. It's normalizing suicide. And that's a very, very despicable thing. Because a lot of people who are in this darkness often will not kill themselves precisely because suicide is a taboo. If we start saying suicide is normal, that last sometimes check and balance protection will be gone. And that's why the assisted suicide folk refuse to call it suicide, even though that's what it is. They call it aid in dying, or they call it death with dignity, or they call it deliverance, whatever it is, because they do not want anyone to think it's suicide because they want more people to do it, and suicide would cause hesitation. They're trying to normalize this. Now, let's talk Belgium. It took the Netherlands decades to get where what I've described, and I haven't described it all, believe me. Belgium legalized euthanasia in 2002, and instead of sliding down the slippery slope, they jumped headfirst into the abyss with a smile on their face. In Belgium, there are joint euthanasia killings of elderly couples who do not necessarily have a physical illness but are worried about future suffering, that is the grief of widowhood. There was one case reported in the Daily Mail in the UK where the son had procured the death doctor. And the son was interviewed, and they said, why did you do this? Why did you arrange this doctor to kill your parents? He said, well, it would have been so hard for me to care for them. This was the best answer. I mean, if you had a son that would do that, wouldn't you want to die? I mean, good grief. That's horrible. There have been stories of a transsexual who was upset with the sex change surgery and was euthanized as a treatment. There's the story of the woman who was sexually predated by her psychiatrist in Belgium. She turned the psychiatrist over to the authorities, wanting him, as we see happening here now in our country with regard to sexual abuse, to be disciplined. They didn't do it, so she went to another psychiatrist and was euthanized as an answer to the fact that she was predated by a different psychiatrist. And then in a bitter irony, a few months later, that original psychiatrist was kicked out. Terrible, terrible things. A set of identical twins who were losing their ability to hear, or they were deaf and they were losing their ability to see. And they were so upset at not being able to see each other anymore, they were jointly euthanized. Belgium blazed the trail for conjoining euthanasia and euthanasia and organ harvesting. You should, now you see why I have so much fun at parties, right? Just be thankful you're not my wife. I mean, I see your faces. It's like, and it's reason for that. I mean, this is very ugly stuff, and it's dark stuff, and it's all true stuff. All true stuff. So the twins were euthanized. I mean, I could go on and on and on about different cases. The conjoining of euthanasia, I've seen a PowerPoint by Belgian doctors where they were telling other doctors, you know, if you're going to have euthanasia, look for people with neuromuscular diseases such as MS or mental illnesses, because they still have good organs, right? And there was one professional journal that I read, and I would think that the organ transplant medical journals would be up in arms about this, because to me it would destroy trust that you're going to kill a patient and then use their organs. But they wrote in this International Organ Transplant Journal about 4 lungs that were taken from people who were euthanized and how the grafts performed in the new patients. And gee, everything went well. And I thought, well, let me dig deeper into this paper. What was the underlying condition that these people had? 3 of the 4 had a neuromuscular disability. The 4th was mentally ill. So I thought, well, what kind of mental illness did this guy have? And this is the bitterest irony I've heard in a long time. Self-harming. Self-harming. So the treatment for self-harming was to be killed. The ultimate self-harm. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that if you tell somebody with a deep existential despair and anguish over a long time, somebody who has a difficult time getting through the night, that their deaths have greater value than their lives, you are performing an absolute cruelty. And it's dangerous to people who are suffering in the extreme in terms of mental illness. The only thing perhaps more dangerous is getting a society to accept that, because that gives them a stake in these killings. Now you might be saying, well, Wesley, this is Belgium, this is the Netherlands, this is, not us, we don't have to worry about it. Well, Canada, it's not too far from here. Canada is our closest cousin as a country, it's our closest cousin as a culture. If we had won the Battle of Quebec, maybe they'd be part of the United States, but we lost the Battle of Quebec. And Canada has euthanasia imposed on it across the country by the Supreme Court, kind of a Roe v. Wade euthanasia. And Canada not only created what I call mere legalization. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Oregon has mere legalization of assisted suicide. It means that if a patient is legally qualified, and in Oregon it's 6 months left to live, which, by the way, doctors often can't know. There have been cases of people who live 3 years beyond receiving the lethal prescription, because we don't die by the numbers. In fact, there are some people who don't die at all. I have a friend who was given 3 months to live with lung cancer, terminal lung cancer, 13 years ago, and he's still with us. So, I mean, that whole idea of 6 months left to live is just a way to open a door for an ideological doctor to go forward. But, be that as it may, when you are in a situation in which you have decided that eliminating the sufferer is the way to go, there aren't going to be any breaks. And in Canada, you have this Roe v. Wade kind of decision. And instead of mere legalization, meaning, yes, it's legal, you can ask a doctor, but you can't force a doctor to do it. That's mere legalization. And the one who's protected in that is the doctor, because the doctor can say yes or say no. So if you say yes, a doctor can't be punished, and if you say no, a doctor can't be punished. That's in the laws here in the United States. What the Canadian Supreme Court did is they took it a step beyond that. They said that there's a positive right to receive this euthanasia if you have a medically diagnosed condition that causes irremediable suffering as defined by the patient, and even to the point where if there are treatments that could alleviate the suffering but the patient would rather die, that's still considered irremediable suffering because the patient doesn't want to have it alleviated. inflicted, and which can include psychological pain. That's a very, very broad mandate for euthanasia. Then the question became, what about Catholic doctors who don't want to commit a cardinal sin of homicide, killing a patient? Because they're not talking assisted suicide in Canada, they're talking lethal injection. What about the Muslim doctor who doesn't wish to do this, or the Jewish doctor, or the atheist doctor who believes in the Hippocratic Oath? But you see, once you've created a positive right to receive something, then the government is obligated to make sure you receive it. And since the government, and of course Canada is against the death penalty, so they're not going to have, excuse me, they're not going to have, you know, I call it, they say the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. I'm not getting into that issue, but then some of the same people who say that say, well, we have to have euthanasia, so I call that cruel and unusual death with dignity. I mean, it makes no sense. They're using the same drugs, right? Only one is for a punishment and one is to eliminate suffering. But it's really, I don't see a real strong difference there in terms of the assisted suicide if you're against the death penalty. And that's, people have to decide that for themselves. In any event, so since Canada's not going to set up a bunch of execution centers for sick people, who do they have to do it? Doctors. So they're going to have to make sure doctors perform it. Now we end up into the issue of medical conscience. And we end up into the issue of potential tyranny, because I submit that forcing someone to commit homicide of an innocent person who is not following a legal military order, that's tyranny. If you can force people to kill, that's tyranny. So there's been a very big fight up in Canada over this issue of medical conscience. And most of the provinces, the Canadian single-payer socialized system is administered by the provinces, each province. So the Parliament kowtowed to the Supreme Court, even though they have something called a notwithstanding clause that could have delayed the Supreme Court action. They just went along with what the Supreme Court told them. The medical establishment jumped in and started doing the jig. They were so happy to be doing this. How much time do I have, by the way? Am I right with that? Okay. So most of the provinces said, okay, because doctors, Catholic doctors, Orthodox Christian doctors, other doctors, they don't want to participate in homicide. We're just going to create a list of death doctors who will be willing to do it. So if a doctor says, no, I'm sorry, I'll do other things, but I won't euthanize you, then the person who wants to be killed can go to this list. If there's an 800 number, they can find a doctor who will then be willing to do the deed. Ontario, the biggest province, said, we're not going to give doctors that out. Ontario passed a law that said a doctor who is presented by a legally qualified patient to be killed must kill that patient or must engage in what they call an effective referral, by which they mean the doctor going out and procuring the euthanasia doctor, meaning the doctor's responsibility, if he will not kill or she will not kill, to go find a doctor that will kill. Which means that that doctor is complicit in that death. Why would they want that? Because when a doctor says no to killing, that sends a powerful message. The culture of death brooks no dissent. And they don't want that message going out there. They don't want doctors saying, no, killing is wrong. Here's what I can do for you. They want doctors being compliant. It's power, as raw as it gets. So some doctors took the province, Ontario, to court. Because you see in the Canadian Charter, which is like our Constitution, the first enumerated right is the right of freedom of religion and conscience. Well, what could be more specific than that? These doctors have a conscience objection to killing and often a religious objection to killing. They brought them to court. The trial court said, yes, indeed, this ruling violates these individual practitioners' Freedom of religion and conscience. It sure does. By golly, yes, sir. Eh? Some of you got the joke. But then the judge found penumbras and emanations, right? Things that were not enumerated in the charter, one of which was that every patient has a legal right to receive an equitable receipt of legal health care, which arises out of life, liberty, and the pursuit of whatever that's in the charter as well. So the judge said, you've got the religious conscience right in conflict with the patient's right. Doctors, you lose. Patients win. And doctors, if you don't like it, get out of medicine. Or go into an area where you won't face that dilemma. So here's what the judge is saying. The judge is saying, if you're an oncologist who's treated cancer patients for years, who has gone through incredible education to get to that place, continued their education as things have gone, and you know, experience is the greatest teacher in any event, that if you don't want to kill, go become a podiatrist. Well, look at the incredible talent that will be taken away if a doctor did that from cancer patients. Because an oncologist doesn't want to kill in Ontario. He or she either has to become something else, for which he or she was not trained, or get out of medicine, which the judge also said. That case will be appealed, but I'm not hopeful, because Canada has accepted the concept that eliminating suffering justifies eliminating the sufferer. Then people say, well, that's not happening in Oregon, right? Here in California. I'm not in California anymore. Here in the United States. Well, they say there have been no abuses in Oregon, right? Okay? There have been abuses in Oregon. The media just doesn't care about them. Let me just tell you one. Back in 2008, there was a woman named Barbara Wagner. How many of you know Barbara Wagner? Anybody? A couple. Barbara Wagner had terminal lung cancer. And there was a fellow named Randy Stroops who had terminal prostate cancer. And their oncologists prescribed chemotherapy. Not to treat and heal the cancer, but to extend life. I mean, that's a normal part of oncology practice. When you get to the place where the cancer is just, unless there's an act of God, is not going to go into remission again or is not going to be healed, you could still extend a patient's life for a significant period of time, 6 months, a year, whatever, with what I call the last-ditch chemo. My dad, when he was dying of cancer, he was given just a couple of months. He tried that last-ditch chemo, and it gave him an extra year in relatively good health, so he was actually able to travel with my mother and do some things that made him happy. So that's a real benefit. It's a medical benefit. It's extra time. Well, so the doctors prescribed this, but Randy Stroops and Barbara Wagner were on Medicaid, the health insurance for the poor. And in Oregon, Medicaid is rationed. It's rationed. And at that time, the way they did the rationing in Oregon was they'd have a list of conditions and treatments. And then they would have a line depending on the money they had in their budget. So let's say it's 600. So if you had the condition or between 600 and up to 1, they would pay for your treatment. But if you were beneath the 600 line, let's say 644, they wouldn't pay for your treatment. One of the ones they wouldn't pay for was that last-ditch shot of chemotherapy. So they sent a letter to Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroops both. Some administrator got a little too honest for his good. Because he said, I'm sorry, we will not pay for this chemotherapy, but, and I'm paraphrasing, take heart, we will pay for your assisted suicide. Can you imagine? Barbara Wagner was devastated, and she went public. And she said, my state will not pay for me to live, but will pay for me to die. Horrible. There have been other examples in Oregon of some abuses of people seeing the doctor. You're supposed to have a 2-week waiting period. They've only met the doctor within 2 weeks of their death, meaning there was no long-term relationship with the patient and the doctor. It was just a death doctor who was ideological, predisposed, usually referred by compassionate choices so that they can get the poison pill. Now, I want to share something else with you to kind of demonstrate to you that this is not about a limited, tiny, little itsy-bitsy exception to the normal rule of do no harm and do not kill and all that. And the other, and that it's only for the perfectly mentally competent. As you know, probably, your neighboring state of Delaware has a proposal for an assisted suicide along the lines of the Oregon law. And when I looked at it, I found something that turned my hair this color. They want to include a right of assisted suicide if you're terminally ill for the intellectually disabled. And they define intellectual disability in the legislation. Quote, intellectual disability means a disability that originated before the age of 18, characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior, which covers many everyday social and practical skills. It's developmental disability, right? Now, people with this intellectual disability or developmental disability are not competent to make their own decisions in these regards. They are not competent to choose their doctors. They are not competent to vote. They're not competent generally to decide where they live, etc., etc. These decisions, a loving community makes on their behalf and in their best interest. But this legislation says that, quote, if the patient has a documented intellectual disability, the attending physician shall refer the patient to a licensed clinical social worker who shall ensure that the patient fully understands the information provided, meaning to kill yourself. We're talking about somebody with an intellectual disability, a developmental disability. Then it goes on. No medication to end a patient's life in a humane and dignified manner. Wait a minute. Dying naturally isn't humane. Dying naturally isn't dignified. That's what they're saying. And on behalf of my dad who died of cancer and my mom who died of Alzheimer's, I resent that. They died with as much dignity as anyone else, and they had as much dignity as anyone else. And all of your loved ones who passed away, the same is true. Death with dignity is not an overdose of poison. And I resent it, and I reject it. Going on. No medication to end a patient's life in a humane and dignified manner may be prescribed unless the licensed clinical social worker has confirmed in writing to the physician that the patient understands the information provided. Well, how loose is that? And if you have a social worker who thinks that eliminating the sufferer is the best thing to do for eliminating suffering, do you know you're going to die, Charlie? Oh, yeah. That could be it. And it goes on. No person is judged mentally incompetent or incapacitated under the provisions of So that's all it takes is if the intellectually disabled person is terminally ill, 6 months or less to live, and a social worker writes a letter saying, oh yes, they understand what this is about, then they can receive assisted suicide too. And then in this article I wrote about it, I quoted the Constitution, the Delaware Constitution. No person is judged mentally incompetent or incapacitated under the provisions of this Constitution from voting shall enjoy the right of an elector. In other words, the people that they are saying should have the right to assisted suicide would not be allowed to vote. They would not be allowed to get a tattoo. But we're going to say, oh yeah, they understand and have poison pills. That just shows you that the actual, sometimes they get ahead of their skis, to use the cliche. The actual agenda is not narrow, it's very broad. And it has to be broad because they've accepted the concept that eliminating suffering is the prime directive. And to show you also, this is not assisted suicide, but they're now promoting forcing nursing homes to starve Alzheimer's patients to death. If the Alzheimer's patient wrote an advanced medical directive saying that if I get to a certain place, and let's say I don't remember my son as my mother got to, didn't know I was her son, that if you get to that place, then I want to die. And that would force nursing homes to withhold food and water, even if they eat it, from these patients, while there's not a right to have a lethal injection. In the Netherlands and Belgium, dementia patients are killed by lethal injection who have filled out an advance directive, even though they may be happy, even though they may no longer think that way. There was one of the worst cases I've ever seen out of the Netherlands, and it was a woman with Alzheimer's disease who was in a nursing home, and she had signed an advance directive saying, I don't want to live when I get in that condition. And so the doctor went in to give her the lethal injection, and the woman fought for her life. She fought and struggled not to be injected, and the doctor made her family hold her down while she was killed. And the Dutch authorities said, oh, that's okay, the doctor was in good faith. Nothing was done. And if that isn't a murder, what is? Nothing was done. Horrible. I'm told I have 5 minutes. I want to end on 2 things. One is that the new Wisconsin assisted suicide provision would destroy medical conscience. That they're getting ahead of their skis again. They are saying that if a doctor doesn't want to prescribe, he has to actively refer, or she has to actively refer. The second thing is I want to warn you that you, even though it's not legal here in Maryland, each and every one of you, each and me too, any one of us in this room, could be the subject of what I call social martyrdom. What do I mean? Social martyrdom would happen like this. As was mentioned in the introduction, California has legal assisted suicide, 33 million people. Oregon has legal assisted suicide. Washington State, Vermont, and Colorado, and Washington, D.C. Montana, I disagree that it's necessarily legal. That's based on a very muddled court case, so we don't know for sure. But that's about 18% of the population of the United States. I'm sure many of you have loved ones in one of those states. What if you get a call, and the call is from Sister Sue, and Sister Sue tells you, Grandma's got cancer, and she's expected to live for 4 or 5 more months. She's decided she doesn't want to put us through that, and she doesn't want to put herself through that. She's dying next Tuesday. We want you to come and be here for her suicide party. They are holding suicide parties in California, extolled by the LA Times. In all of these states, you'll see all the news stories. Oh, the family was there and they held her hand, etc. There was a huge New York Times front page story about a suicide party from Canada where a man was euthanized at the end. And they want you to come. Grandma wants you to be here. Well, what do? If you say no, then Sister Sue says, how dare you push your religion on me? How dare you betray Grandma that way? Because Grandma put you through college. Grandma loved you, and now you're isolating her and abandoning her. But if you say yes, you're complicit in a suicide because you validated the suicide. That's a sin for many people in many churches. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, you're telling Grandma her worst fears are true. That she's a burden, that her life isn't worth living, and so forth. What do? If you say no, you're subjected to social martyrdom because you might be excluded from the family. You might be isolated. You might be ostracized. If you say yes, then you're a participant. Be ready. These are the dilemmas we face. I'm going to end on a cheerier note. I've been a hospice volunteer. And my first patient was a fellow named Ernie. And I went to see Ernie, and I was nervous because he was my first patient. I received 8 weeks of training and so forth. By the way, one of the things I was trained in hospice was if a patient is suicidal, you get suicide prevention going. I got to interview Dame Cecily Saunders, the great medical humanitarian who started the modern hospice movement, and she told me that assisted suicide violates the intrinsic dignity of her patients, and she was dead set against it. And so I see Ernie, and Ernie was an elderly man, and I'm introduced, I go into the room, and as soon as Ernie's son, he was living with his son and daughter, as soon as they left, Ernie fell into my arms, and he's crying, and he says, I want to die, I want to die, I want to die. And I said, Ernie, why do you want to die? I'm a burden, I'm a burden. I said, Ernie, you're not a burden. Your son loves you, your daughter-in-law, new marriage, she's so happy to be, I'm a burden, I'm a burden. Well, I went to see Ernie once a week for 4 hours, for several weeks. I would say about 6, 8 weeks. And every time I was there, love is kind of like a savings account. Ernie was obviously a very loving man. Because every time I was there, and I would go different days of the week, people were knocking on the doors. They were bringing cookies. They were bringing soufflés. People were telling Ernie how much they cared about him. And I saw the old man's countenance pick up into a much happier connotation. He had heart failure. And there was one guy who would visit him all the time. And I don't remember his name, but let's call him Joe. And every time Joe would come over, I'd leave the two gentlemen alone so that they could talk, and I'd go into another room. But Joe had a very loud voice. And Joe would always say, Ernie, you gotta fight, Ernie, you gotta fight, you gotta fight. Well, eventually I lost Ernie. He didn't die, he got better. He was kicked out of the hospice. And the last time I saw Ernie, he was an Italian gentleman. He played a mandolin serenade for me because he was so pleased with, my friendship. And then he said, Wesley, you know my friend Joe? And I said, yeah, Ernie, I know Joe. Wesley, you stay away from Joe. I said, why? He's an undertaker. Which of those two scenarios is true compassion, which means to suffer with? Now, of course, not everybody who ends up in Ernie's situation gets out of hospice, but some do. But even if you don't, do we want to promote a policy of life with dignity? Because hospice isn't about dying, it's about living. Where we care for people, where we take the time to hold their hand, make sure that their fears are helped, make sure their pain is alleviated, or do we want to dispose of the situation quickly and sterilely and efficiently? I know the people of Maryland will make the right choice if they understand the true stakes in this debate. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen. And now, everybody here, you have a question for Wesley Smith, please write it down in this index card and hold it up, and Frank will be along to pick it up. While we're waiting for those questions to come up, I have a stock question for Wesley. We've been given a bit of a reprieve here in Maryland. Our proponents of physician-assisted suicide have decided not to file that bill for this legislative session. What should we know it's coming back next year or the year after. What should we be doing now to prepare ourselves for this battle?
Thank you for that. The assisted suicide advocates believe as deeply in their cause as I do in mine. And they're very well funded, and they're very, I have to hand it to them, they've got a work ethic. They're indomitable, they're like the Energizer Bunny. They keep coming back and back and back. They'll say we have to have a conversation, and we have to talk about this, and they'll keep wanting a conversation until they win, then conversations end. If they're not going to pull a fast one this year, now in California, the way assisted suicide was legalized, I was still living there at the time, we'd actually defeated it in committee, and Jerry Brown called a special session to deal with Medicaid funding. The Speaker of the Assembly took all the Democrats in the committee who had voted no on assisted suicide, pulled them out of the special session, filled it with Democrats who voted yes on assisted suicide. They got it through in 2 weeks. So watch out for I don't know if you do it in Maryland, but in California they have something called gut and amend, where they'll pass a bill on naming a school after John Quincy Adams, and then in the other house, they'll take that bill, take out the John Quincy Adams stuff, put in the assisted suicide stuff, and then pass it through that house and bring it back as a fait accompli to the other house. That also, they've tried that in California, the one time we defeated it. So be aware that they might try to pull a fast one. But if they're actually laying low, I suspect because it's an election year, now's the time to A, get your alliances together so that when it comes up again, you have a strengthened alliance of strange political bedfellows to fight assisted suicide. Who are the strongest opponents of assisted suicide in blue states? The disability rights movement. Now, you need to make alliance with them even though they will disagree with you on, generally speaking, on abortion. Because the issue here is saving lives. So, right now is a good time to get to know, and I know we've talked, you've done some of that, get to know people in the disability rights community. Get to have good relationships with them. Start working with the medical community to be prepared with your arguments to oppose this when and if it's filed again, and it's not if, it's when. Also, mainly, talk to your neighbors. You know, people do not change their minds because I give a speech. People change their minds because over dinner you all share with them why assisted suicide is wrong. You are the people who can prevent this from happening by talking to your neighbors over the back fence. If somebody is walking down the street with you and they see somebody in a wheelchair and they say, you know, if I was in that wheelchair, I'd want to kill myself. That's a perfect opportunity for you to say, no, nobody's, suicide bait. Let's talk about this. Start raising consciousness and awareness and be prepared because when they come, they're going to come. And also make sure that when in this election, you put politicians, make them take a stand. I don't know any politician, very few, there are a couple, who run on legalizing assisted suicide. They don't run on it. This is not a grassroots movement. People are not marching in the streets demanding the right to be killed. If they ask, if it polls, it's always just like a first impression. But the more people learn about it, the less they like it. Make these politicians take a stand now during the election and elect as many people as you believe will oppose this agenda as you can. They will be coming. They've been here before. They're going to come again. If you got a respite this year, it may be because of political considerations and they were asked to back off. So next year, if they're not doing it this year, next year they may think they've got it made. Therefore, the elections are important this year. Okay. Why don't U.S. assisted suicide advocates want doctors present at the suicide? In the Netherlands, doctors have to be present at the euthanasia. That's one of the guidelines, and that's one of the few things that the Dutch actually enforce. I don't think that the American activists would be against it, but they don't want to require it because if they required it, doctors would turn against them in droves and they'd never pass any laws. So it's a complete expedient. But also, they don't want this idea of, as I said, which is going to be more pressing, of doctors saying no. Also, there's a lot of times people's own doctors will not go along with this. So the doctor who ends up writing the prescription may not even know the patient and may not even live in the area where the patient is, where they make an appointment just to get the prescription. So, but the main thing I think is that they don't want to require that because doing that would make it much harder to pass these laws. If and when the new law is passed here, what can we do to protect ourselves? Well, you can certainly, they're not going to be dragging you off and killing you if the law passes here. But you can make sure people know you don't want assisted suicide. You could fill out an advance directive that says, even if it's legal, I don't want assisted suicide if I become incompetent. And you can make sure that you let people know, if it's a religious belief, that this is based on your religious belief, like a Catholic. That I'm a Catholic, and we are against suicide, and this would be against my morals. Regardless of my condition, I don't want assisted suicide. And then have a family around that loves you, and love the family members you're with. And this parish, nobody in this parish's area should die alone. You may end up finding, if it becomes legal, that you have to kind of create the equivalent of the crisis pregnancy centers, where people can go and find that there's another way to go. and reach out to save lives. Because just because it's legal doesn't mean that the day is done and the issue is over. At that point, you go into resistance, you fight it in any way you can, and you try to help people make a choice not to kill themselves.
You can do 2 at a time.
Okay.
So I'll take that.
I'm entering pharmacy school this fall, and I heard pharmacists are the biggest healthcare providers for physician-assisted suicide. What is the best way to approach the situation while I'm in school? Well, they're the biggest providers in the sense that the pharmacists have to dispense the drugs. They're not involved in the actual diagnosis of the condition or in the creating of the prescription, but they are involved in the drugs. What a pharmacist has to do is make sure they're protected by a conscience clause. That the law, any law that is in, states that they do not have to participate. And then if they don't participate, make sure that if their employer tries to punish them, that they take advantage of the conscience laws that exist in the United States. Many of you may have heard that the Trump administration is putting a renewed emphasis on conscience protections. They've announced through the HHS, Health and Human Services, Office of Civil Rights, they're opening a new office for medical conscience. The usual suspects have howled in anger and fury. But if this, and I believe it will, if the Trump administration opens this office, you will now have a friend in the federal government that can protect existing conscience rights. And will also, I believe, expand them to include assisted suicide. But if there's a law and legislation that's going through the process here in Maryland, or in any state you may be going to school, look at it very carefully and make sure, if you can, that there is a conscience protection as exists in every law currently in the United States, although the Wisconsin legislation I mentioned is trying to do away with it. So you know that's where we're heading. And you may end up facing what I call medical martyrdom, which is you may have to decide between your profession and your conscience. I was in Australia. I did a nationwide tour in 2010 against euthanasia, and Victoria, Australia, has a law on abortion that says every doctor who is approached for an abortion must provide the abortion or must procure the abortionist. And I know one doctor who was punished because he refused to refer for a sex selection abortion. But the point of this is I was in Victoria, which is Sydney, which is the East Coast, and eventually I found myself in Perth, which is on the West Coast. And I went to an event, and some doctors introduced themselves to me, and they said, we used to live in Sydney, now we're here in Perth. And I said, why did you move to Perth? And they said, because of the abortion law. We refused to participate in abortion, so we basically escaped Victoria. Now think about that. That's like moving from New York to LA. Completely different culture. You don't know people. You basically become a refugee in your own country, and you've uprooted your practice and moved to a different part of the country. So I said to them, well, what if Perth passes such a law? And they said, we'll have to go someplace else. I said, what if there's no place else to go here? They said, we'll have to go overseas. I said, what if there's nowhere to go? They said, we'll have to give up medicine. There is a desire. Go to firstthings.com. Look up my article, Pro-Lifers Get Out of Medicine. There is a concerted desire to drive pro-life doctors and nurses and pharmacists out of healthcare. Ezekiel Emanuel. How many of you have heard of Ezekiel Emanuel?
I was writing that on here for you to get to.
Ezekiel Emanuel, who is one of the architects of Obamacare, one of the most prestigious bioethicists in this country. His brother is Rahm Emanuel, who's the mayor of Chicago, wrote a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine saying that if a patient asks a doctor to do a legal procedure and the doctor has a conscientious objection, but the procedure is accepted in the medical community, that doctor must do the procedure. I mean, this could be anything from assisted suicide. He specifically mentioned abortion in the article, sex change surgeries, whatever it might be. And he wrote specifically, if you don't want to do that, become a radiologist, just like that judge in Canada, or get out of medicine. There is a desire to drive medical professionals who are pro-life and take a sanctity of life, a Hippocratic Oath type approach to healthcare out of medicine. These kinds of articles are very prominent in many medical journals and bioethics journals. As I mentioned earlier, a Canadian judge has already ruled that way. You saw the reaction to the Trump administration, not even changing the law, but saying they're going to improve the emphasis on conscience. You saw the bellowing, the New York Times. Yeah. And there's a corollary to that. They don't want pro-lifers to go into medicine. They don't want pro-lifers to go into nursing, and they don't want pro-lifers to go into pharmacy unless they're willing to do these deeds. I call that medical martyrdom. So people are going to have to make a decision. Now, I hope people will go into it and stand against it, stand athwart it.
Yeah.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
Because a message of resistance goes a long way, because people looked at doctors and nurses and pharmacists for approval as to not only what they're doing, but for what's right and what's wrong. Ethically required. Take that risk. Go in and stand strong against it. I'm not saying look for problems, but if it comes, stand strong and resist.
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
No, I mean, there is an article on Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel at the edge of the Respect Life table on your way out. It's the table on your left as you go out.
Next question. Federal law may preclude legality of physician-assisted suicide, but has the Supreme Court ruled on existing states' enacted laws? No, they have not. The Supreme Court has said that there is not a constitutional right to assisted suicide. 9-0 back in 1997. And that was Luxburg v. Washington and Bagel v. Quill. 2 cases, 9-0, no constitutional right to assisted suicide. Now, when you read those decisions, some of the concurrent opinions would seem to want it. But you know, in my opinion, why they didn't dare do it? Because of Roe v. Wade and the ruckus the pro-life movement made in that decision's wake. They didn't want to go there again. So there is no constitutional right. I do not think that there will ever be a case that gets to the Supreme Court that says assisted suicide is unconstitutional. I just don't see it getting there. I'm afraid it just won't get there. One of the reasons why Judge Gorsuch received such resistance from the assisted suicide movement, he wrote a book against assisted suicide in 2007. And so the assisted suicide movement was going around saying, he's going to outlaw assisted suicide. Actually, he's not. The reason they were upset is they want to make another run at a Roe v. Wade assisted suicide decision. They want to wait till they get a, this is my opinion on this.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, thanks. Sorry. My opinion is they want to get to a tipping point, let's say 15 or 20 states. And then they want to take another run at the Supreme Court because they can say, well, look at all these states. Why should where you live matter whether you get death with dignity? There have been no abuses, which of course is baloney, so let's have this constitutional right. Well, you'd say, wait a second, the Constitution hasn't changed, but the hubris of judges might. That's what happened in Canada. There had been a case in 1994 saying there was no constitutional right to euthanasia in Canada. And then just 20 years later, it was 9-0 that there was. The charter hadn't changed, the hubris of judges had changed. So they were upset because Gorsuch would not look to vote yes on an assisted suicide constitutional right. That was their real opposition, in my opinion. Any other questions?
It's 9 o'clock,
And we're done.
so I think we're going to.
They got the hook!
We have plenty of questions, but I think it's Jack's turn.
Thank you.
Just a few concluding remarks for our Facebook Live audience. Thank you, people out there on Facebook Live, for tuning in. This talk, by the way, immediately after its conclusion, will be
posted, so you'll be able to watch it again and forward it to your friends. Thank you, David. A few upcoming events. On Thursday, March the 15th, our next speaker for Facebook Live will be Zachary King, former Satanist and abortionist, and convert. He has a fascinating story to tell. So mark that date on your smartphones. Thursday evening, March the 5th. And then on Thursday evening, April the 19th, Reggie Littlejohn, who's fighting forced abortion and sexual slavery in China, will be a speaker again on Facebook Live. Please note the poster to my left, ways that those of you out watching on Facebook Live can donate. Simply go to defendlife.org/ways to give, and you can give online. And then, again, remember this talk will be immediately posted so you can share it with your friends. Thank you very much for watching on Facebook Live. Now, those of you who are still here in the audience in St. Louis, we do have a few closing remarks just for you. And that's this. First of all, we can bring up the t-shirt and the wood carving, Frank or David. The next few talks are phenomenal. Zachary King will be speaking on April, March 15th and 16th. The former Satanist and abortionist, he had this miraculous, instantaneous conversion to Catholicism. Jack Hussain here, the head of Our Lady Center, is doing a phenomenal job there. And by the way, that's where Wesley will be speaking tomorrow at 1 o'clock. They had Zachary King speak there a few years ago. I won't tell you what his conversion story is, but it's absolutely miraculous. He's a modern-day St. Paul. So he'll be our speaker on March 15th and 16th. And then Reggie Littlejohn, fighting forced abortion and sexual slavery, will be our speaker on April 19th and 20th. So we have some phenomenal speakers coming up. So mark those talks on your smartphone. For more information, go to defendlife.org. By the way, bring up the t-shirt if you would, wherever it is. No. We want to get rid of things like abortion and assisted suicide, euthanasia, right? This is a simple way to do it. I have so much fun wearing my pro-life t-shirt. So anybody can get one of these absolutely free. The only caveat is you have to promise to wear at least one day a week in public. That's not a big deal, is it? And look at the back of it. Read that if you would, David. Abortion.
One heart stops, another heart breaks.
Right. And what's sort of unique about the front of it? What's inside the O? A baby, right? So I tell you, this is unmistakable. We're not talking about plant life. We're not talking about animal life. We're talking about human life. And I could tell you great stories. What happens when you wear a pro-life t-shirt? We have to be proudly pro-life. And another thing we want to make sure of is that we have a Face the Truth tour coming up the last full week of July, and we want you to come out and participate. Defend Life has really grown like a rocket ever since we started these way back in the year 2001. As Father Frank Pavoni said so many times, America will not reject abortion until America sees abortion. And if we allow abortion, who's next? We are. That's where we are, and that's why we had this great talk tonight by Wesley Smith. And let's go down to the donation. There's two ways you can give. Number one, you can give online, as you see in that poster, but if you'd like to just drop some money in the basket, you can do that now. If you'd like to write a check and make it payable to Defend Life, everything you give is 100% tax deductible. And a couple of other things that are important is, excuse me while I look at my notes here. Oh, if you still have one of the cards for the registration cards that you didn't turn in for the drawing, just hold that up, and Frank will come by and pick that up. And then bring those cards up so we can have the drawing for that beautiful wood carving of our Lord Jesus Christ with his crown of thorns. Carved by one of the few remaining Christians in the Holy Land from olive wood. The olive trees have to be 100 years old before they cut them down. And I'm sure one of these wonderful Catholic priests would love to bless it for you. So one of you gets to take that home with you. So if somebody could bring up those cards when we're ready, that would be wonderful.
They've been shuffled and cut by our speaker, so if you want to take the
Great.
top one.
Okay, tell you what, how about if we have our illustrious speaker pick the winner, and it's okay to pick your own name.
I want a commission.
And read the name of the winner.
Elizabeth Arlinghouse.
Okay, Elizabeth.
That's an inside job.
And thank your dad too. Yeah, we guarantee it was not fixed. I especially do want to thank Frank and his wonderful wife Sue for all the good work they did and all the others here. And I understand we have some wonderful refreshments. And I'm sure some of you would like to have more questions, one-on-one FaceTime with our wonderful speaker, Wesley Smith. Let's hear it for Wesley. Thank you very much. I think the refreshments are over to your left.
So, Wesley. So what's the latest?
Thank you so much, Mark.
You got my book a couple of years ago. You have my book of rabbits and babies and dogs and wolves. And that's about time you have to, the best thing to do is continually distinguish between animal rights, which is animal and animal warfare. Yeah, I ran the movie. It's not the same thing, the same variable. So keep making that distinction. And if people are talking animal welfare and they use the term animal rights, no one can say, no, that's not animal rights, that's animal welfare. Animal rights is an ideology. And if people aren't aware of that, because the term is very much
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Press the finish or something like that?
You're a delegate.
Okay, so battery pack and something.